I really messed up during my bachelor party trip. My fiancée moved on, and now all I want is to win her back. 5 years ago, I, Adam 28, made a choice that completely wrecked my life. At the time, I had everything going for me. I was the new guy at my firm, working as an architect, mostly designing subdivisions, and I was really enjoying it. I had been with my girlfriend Sarah, 29F now, 24 then, for 3 years, and we had recently gotten engaged. I thought nothing could go wrong. After Sarah said yes, we started planning the wedding. Neither of us wanted a big traditional wedding, so we decided to elope to a coastal city, San Diego to be exact. Parents and siblings were welcome to join if they wanted, but it was basically just going to be our honeymoon with a wedding ceremony included. Since the trip was going to be relatively inexpensive, we agreed to splurge a bit on some pre-wedding activities. Instead of traditional bachelor and bachelorette parties, we decided to cross some things off our bucket lists. Sarah wanted to swim with sharks, so she and her best friend Maggie booked a cage diving trip to Florida for a long weekend. My dream was a bit different. I had always wanted to visit Thailand. It was something I'd been fascinated with since I was 10 years old and had sworn I'd go one day. Sarah actually encouraged me to go, reminding me that I had even mentioned Thailand on our first date. 6 months into our engagement, it was finally time for me and my best friend Tyler to head off on the trip. The first 3 days were fantastic. We enjoyed the beaches, visited temples, and did a lot of drinking. But on the third night, Tyler got absolutely wasted. I was annoyed because we had a jungle excursion planned for the next day, something I had been really looking forward to. I had paced myself avoiding heavy drinking so I could enjoy it. The next morning, Tyler was nursing a massive hangover and refused to get out of bed. He suggested we reschedule the excursion for the next day, but I wasn't having it. I decided to go on my own. I went out to grab breakfast and saw a guy on the side of the road offering jungle excursions for cheap. He had a Jeep, and when he saw me checking out his sign, he gave me the hard sell. It seemed a bit sketchy, but he spoke English really well, which made me feel comfortable. So I went with him. At first, the trip was great. We went off-road through the jungle, and I had no idea where we were going, but I was enjoying it. Then things took a turn for the worse. We pulled into a small clearing, and I was looking around when suddenly local law enforcement showed up. I couldn't understand most of what they were saying, just picking up a word here and there. They searched the guy's Jeep and found a large stash of meth. I was panicking. They took both of us to a small station in the middle of nowhere. That's when I realized this guy had taken me across the border into Cambodia. Worse, I didn't have my ID or passport on me. They were back in the hotel room. The cops wouldn't listen to anything I said, and I had no idea what my guide was telling them. I was terrified, but tried to reassure myself that Tyler would realize I was missing and look into where I might be. I won't go into all the details of what the next 4.5 years were like, but it was a living hell. A Cambodian jail is far from a hospitable place. It took 5 months before I even saw a judge. The judicial system was incredibly backlogged, and public defenders were scarce and only available in the big cities. Throughout all this time, I wasn't allowed to contact anyone back home. My first time in front of a judge, there was no interpreter, and the trial got postponed for another 5 months. After finally entering a plea, it was another 14 months before I had my actual hearing. The judge was fair and dismissed my charges on time served, but the prosecutor appealed the dismissal, which put me back in custody for another 28 months. That was the most crushing moment of my life. I thought I was about to be free, only to be thrown back in for over 2 more years. During this time, I came to the realization that everyone back home thought I was dead. I had gone missing, and Tyler had no clue where I was. The last time I had called back was on the morning I got arrested, and I had only left vague messages about going on a jungle excursion. My parents, my fiancé, they had no idea what had happened to me. I missed them more than words can describe. There were days when I just wished one of the other inmates or a brutal guard would end it for me, especially after the first year when I'd grown more tolerant of the terrible food and water. Finally, after 52 months in captivity, I was released. I had nothing to my name and found myself in a country I wasn't supposed to be in. I contacted the embassy, and they did have a missing persons file for me. They helped me get in touch with home. I tried calling my fiancé, but a guy named Mitch answered and said he didn't know anyone named Sarah, so I figured she must have changed her number. That's when I called my mother. She was frantic when she heard my voice. My dad joined the call, and I told them everything that had happened. I kept asking about Sarah, but my mom kept avoiding the topic. She wanted to focus on getting me home, saying we would talk about everything once I got back to the US. The process took some time, but luckily, my parents still had my original passport and ID, which sped things up a bit. In the meantime, they sent me money so I could get a hotel. Throughout this period, my parents were adamant that I shouldn't try to contact Sarah until I got home. I started to assume that Sarah had moved on and was with someone else. It broke my heart, but based on how my parents were acting, it seemed like a reality I had to accept. Even though I suspected she had moved on, I still wanted to talk to her more than anything else. I didn't care about discussing my time in Cambodia or hearing about what everyone had done to try and find me. I just wanted my fiancée back. When I finally got home, my parents sat me down and handed me a save-the-date card. It was Sarah and some tall, handsome guy I had never seen before. She was engaged. I broke down. It wasn't unexpected, but the pain was still overwhelming. I asked my parents if they had kept in touch with Sarah beyond being invited to the wedding, and they said yes. They'd actually been a huge part of her life over the past few years. I was a little shocked. I knew they liked Sarah, but I figured with me gone, they would have drifted apart, not grown closer. I asked, "So how close are you now?" My mom responded, "Very close. Her father passed away about a year ago, and your dad has agreed to walk her down the aisle." That stung. It shouldn't have, but it did. All I could say was, "Why you?" My mom started to get emotional, explaining how they all thought I was gone, how they searched for so long, and how they believed I'd been taken by a cartel or worse. They even held a memorial service for me. I snapped, "I don't care about that right now. What are you not telling me?" That's when my mother grabbed the tablet and flipped through a few photos. She handed it back to me, and there was a group picture. My parents, Sarah, her fiancé, her mom, my sister, my brother, Tyler, and some other friends, along with a few kids. In the center of the table was a boy sitting behind a birthday cake. The decorations read, "Happy 4th birthday." He was smiling, full of joy. I looked at my parents in disbelief. My mom looked at me and said, "That's your son, Jason Paul," my dad's name, Adam Ryan, our last name. In the 2 weeks since I've been back, it feels like so much has happened, yet nothing has changed. I've been brought up to speed on everything that happened while I was gone. After Tyler finally got up that day, he tried calling me, but my phone had been confiscated by the police upon my arrest, and I never saw it again. Thinking I was just enjoying my jungle excursion, Tyler went about his day. By nightfall, he started to get concerned. He called home, asking if anyone had heard from me. The next morning, my family and Sarah were frantically calling Tyler, wondering if I had returned. That's when Tyler started going around to the excursion companies, but none of them had seen me. He panicked and alerted everyone back home. My parents, brother, and fiancé flew out to Thailand and spent a month canvassing the area, but they had to return home eventually. My parents even made another trip back later to search again, but there were no leads. For a year and a half, they kept pressing the Thai authorities about my disappearance, but no one thought to look in Cambodia. Meanwhile, Sarah found out she was pregnant. The day I left for Thailand, she was unknowingly about 10 weeks along. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for her missing me while pregnant with my child. I wish I had never gone on that trip. My parents told me that Sarah leaned on them a lot, and they were more than happy to help. Over the years, they all became incredibly close. Sarah's parents were supportive, but they were older and not in great health, so my mom took Sarah to many of her OB appointments. My mom was even in the delivery room alongside Sarah's mom when Jason was born. He came early at 34 weeks, and it was stressful, but thankfully Jason showed no signs of health issues, though they kept him under observation for a while. My parents have told me they really needed this. The not knowing what happened to me was an unbearable weight on them, and the birth of their grandson gave them some much-needed relief from the grief. They keep apologizing, but honestly, they didn't do anything wrong. I guess it's just guilt now that they know I was out there and they feel like they failed to find me. Tyler has come by to see me. He's apologized more times than I can count. He's gotten married since the trip and now has 2 kids. He seems nervous around me, which I guess is understandable. I do hold some resentment toward him, even though it wasn't his fault. The feeling is just there anyway. My brother and sister have moved forward with their lives. My brother has kids now, and my sister is married. I missed all of that. I could probably find a way to get over everything else, but losing my fiance and missing out on 4 years with my son, it's just been too much. My parents set me up with a therapist. I went to the first session, but I honestly didn't know what to talk about. I mean, I was wrongfully imprisoned for 5 years, beaten at times, starved at times. I've got plenty of PTSD. My whole family thought I was dead, and they even held a memorial service for me 3 years to the day of my disappearance. I was supposed to marry the love of my life, and now she's engaged to someone else. On top of all that, I have a 4-year-old son who's been raised by my replacement since he was 18 months old. Jason only knows this guy as Dad. He calls him Dad. And here I am, back from the dead, throwing everyone's perfect lives into chaos. I'm ranting, but it's all just too much to process. I still haven't spoken directly to Sarah. The day after I returned, my dad went to her house. He sat down with her and her fiancé Brian, 34M, and told them that I had been found. At first, Sarah thought he meant they had found my body, and she started to cry. When he clarified, she broke down completely. Her fiancé comforted her, and according to my dad, she just sat there in silence after that. I tried texting her, but I didn't get a response for an entire day. Then I finally got a message back. "I'm so sorry, I just can't right now." I haven't asked anyone much about Brian, except to learn that they've been engaged for about 2 months, and the wedding is in 6 months. No one has volunteered any more details. We were supposed to meet at the park last weekend. My sudden reappearance has disrupted everyone's sense of normalcy, and I can tell things are tense. My mom usually watches Jason while Sarah and Brian are at work, and she used to watch him at our house. But ever since I got back, she's only been watching him at Sarah's place. Apparently, they're preparing him to meet me. He knows I'm his biological father. My pictures have always been around my parents' house, and Sarah has always kept a photo of me up in Jason's room. I'm not the guy in the picture anymore, but at least I still kind of look like him. He won't be blindsided. My parents and I got to the park first. When Sarah's car pulled up, only Brian and Jason got out. Sarah wasn't with them. Jason ran to my dad first and gave him a big hug. When he saw me, he retreated toward my mom and then over to Brian. He was nervous, and honestly, so was I. The other adults tried to get us to interact, but I told them to let it go and let Jason play. He perked up and ran off to the playground. Brian came over, stuck out his hand, and we shook. He said, "Sorry, Sarah couldn't come today. We were about to leave and she just broke down and said she wasn't ready." I just nodded and said, "I understand." I headed over to the playground to try and bond with Jason in some way. It turns out he's really into superheroes. He pretended to be Spider-Man, and I played Rhino, chasing him around the playground while he webbed me up. He laughed and smiled, and for a moment, I thought maybe this wouldn't be so hard. Then he called Brian Dad. I shouldn't have been surprised. Brian has been in Jason's life for 2.5 years, and he's about to marry Sarah. They all live together. Still, hearing him call someone else Dad felt like a knife in the heart. I started to tear up and excused myself, saying I needed to use the Gross Park bathroom. After a minute, when I came out, Brian was waiting for me. I saw my parents across the way, keeping an eye on Jason. I felt awkward. This was the last thing I wanted, a heart-to-heart with Brian. He was taller, more built than me, and living the life I was supposed to have. He just said, "Can we talk?" I sighed and said, "Yeah, man, what's on your mind?" Brian began. "Look, I'm sorry for everything that happened to you. It's a tough situation all around. I just wanted to talk because I'm really worried about Sarah and Jason, especially Sarah. She hasn't been herself lately, which I get. It took her a long time to get over you. I'm the first person she dated after your disappearance, and she cried the first time we kissed because it was different. I want you to have a relationship with your son. He's young and he's resilient. I grew up with 2 dads, so I know Jason will be fine, but I'm not sure how Sarah or you will handle it if things move too fast. From a selfish standpoint, I don't want anything disrupting our lives or our engagement. I love her and want what's best for her. I think it's important for both of you to take things slow and process everything before you meet face to face. I've made an appointment for her to see a counselor. I'd really appreciate it if you could respect that and not push her or reach out until she's had time to figure things out on her own." As I listened to him, I felt pissed. What a pretentious ass. But annoyingly, he made some good points. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. I ended up saying, "Yeah, man, I can do that," and walked off to join my parents and Jason. Brian went into the grimy park bathroom. When he came back, he said he and Jason were heading out. Jason gave everyone hugs, including me, which surprised me but also made me happy. Then he called me Rhino and ran back to Brian. As they walked away, I heard him ask, "Dad, can we get a cookie cake on the way home?" Oh, he's Dad, and I'm Rhino. This just sucks. Finally, Sarah and I met. We started by texting a bit, but the conversations felt impersonal and stayed surface level. The deepest we got was talking about Jason, and I briefly mentioned what Cambodian prison was like. Over the next 3 weeks, we texted maybe 5 times. Each time the conversation started to get heavy, one of us would end it. During that time, though, I spent more time with Jason. My mom began watching him at her house again, which gave us more chances to bond. One day, we even had some one-on-one time when we went out for ice cream. It's amazing how resilient kids are. He just goes with the flow of everything. He still calls me Rhino, but maybe I'll earn the dad title eventually. Then, one day last week, when Brian came by to pick Jason up, he asked to talk again. At first, I got pissed, thinking he was going to offer me some job. Instead, he explained that it wasn't an offer but more of a lead. His brother owns a construction company and is looking for an estimator. Brian told him that I used to be an architect, and his brother said he'd give me an interview if I was interested. Brian left his brother's card with me. I really want to hate him, but I have to admit he seems like a genuinely good guy. It pisses me off even more that I can't hate him. He's got this self-deprecating sense of humor that's pretty infectious, even in the short conversations we've had. But at the same time, all I can think is, fuck that guy. This past Friday, I texted Sarah and we agreed to meet for lunch the next day. I suggested we go to this Italian place that had been our spot, but she got upset and I thought she was going to cancel. Instead, we pivoted to Applebee's. Seeing her in person was indescribable. She was as beautiful as ever. The hello hug sent shivers down my spine, and I didn't want to let go. I probably lingered a little too long, but didn't want to make it weird. We exchanged small talk while ordering, but once that was done, the conversation took a serious turn for the first time since I came back, and it stayed that way for the next hour. She opened up about how hard it had been to cope with losing me. She was grieving while pregnant, and said there were days when she didn't even want to go on. Hearing her talk about it hurt like hell. She said she felt so alone in our apartment that she spent most nights staying with her parents or mine. She kept hoping that every time the phone rang it would be news about me. But then she started dreading those calls, fearing it would be someone saying they'd found my body. She talked about how amazing my parents had been to her and how they had all grown closer over the years. My sister-in-law was pregnant at the same time as Sarah, so they bonded over their shared experiences during their pregnancies. It was after Jason's first birthday that my parents, of all people, talked to Sarah about getting back out there. She admitted that she was mainly spending time with her parents, my parents, or my sister-in-law and brother. She even drifted away from her best friend. Sarah told me it was out of fear. She never wanted to be away from Jason, thinking that if I could disappear in an instant, then anyone could. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him too. But after my parents intervened, she realized she was living like a widow and not like a 25-year-old woman. So she started reconnecting with her friends and allowed others to watch Jason occasionally so she could go out. It was about 2 months into her attempt at living life again that she ran into Brian. They met at a Starbucks. She was fumbling with her phone while holding Jason when this tall, handsome guy, my words, came up and scanned his phone, buying her coffee and a muffin. They struck up a conversation while waiting for their orders. When her order was called, he grabbed it, handed it to her, and gave her his business card with his number on it. Brian owns a screen printing shop. He said, "No pressure, but I'd love to get to know you better." Then they parted ways. She called him the next day. 4 months later, she introduced Jason to him. And a year after that, they moved in together. A few months ago, they got engaged. This is when I said my piece. I told her that I still loved her and that it was impossibly hard to see her with someone else. The thought of getting back to her was one of the few things that kept me going while I was locked away. She started to cry, and I reached out and took her hand. I asked if she was sure, or if there was any way we could try again. In hindsight, I know it was a selfish move, but at the time, I needed to know. She shook her head, looked up at me, and said, "I love you." I never stopped, but I love Brian too, and I'm marrying him. It's not fair. I know it's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong, but I had to move on. I spent years thinking you had died. When you came back, I was happy, but I also felt guilty. I cut her off. You have nothing to feel guilty about. I screwed up and it cost me everything. I always knew you had probably moved on, and I don't blame you for that. I was gone, and there was no reason for you to think I'd ever come back. But I did dream of returning and finding you waiting for me. I know now that was unrealistic. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. She nodded and said, "It's okay. I knew this conversation was coming eventually." We just stopped talking after that, sitting there in silence, drinking our coffee. After what felt like an eternity, she finally asked, "How do you want to move forward when it comes to Jason?" I told her, I love him already and want to be in his life. She smiled and said, "I'm so happy to hear that. I always told him about you. I never wanted him to think you abandoned him." I responded, "He's the one bright spot in all of this." She then told me that Brian had planned to adopt Jason once they were married, but those plans were off the table now that I had returned. I'm listed as Jason's father on his birth certificate, though I plan to meet with a lawyer just to make sure everything is in order legally. We made plans to meet with Jason later that week and spend time together as a family. She also encouraged me to continue having one-on-one time with him. We hugged one last time before parting ways. When I got back to my parents' house, I broke down. The finality of it all hit me hard. But after I recovered, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wallow in my grief anymore. I needed to swallow my pride and start rebuilding my life. The next day, I called Brian's brother and did an interview that same day. He hired me. That was the first step toward moving on. Now brace yourself, because you won't believe what's happened in the past 6 months. It's been absolutely crazy, but in a good way. After that first face-to-face meeting with Sarah, I decided to get my life back on track. I got hired as an estimator for Brian's brother, Mike, 36M, who owns a construction company. About 2 months into the job, Mike, knowing I was an architect, started asking me to design some of his custom homes to compare them with his usual architect's work. He liked my designs better. While I still work as an estimator, I'm now solely responsible for designing the custom homes for Mike. And he gave me a huge raise. That allowed me to move out of my parents' house and get my own apartment. Sarah and Brian's wedding plans moved forward, with only one major change. My father was no longer walking her down the aisle. Everyone agreed that given my return, it would have been inappropriate. Instead, her much older brother is going to take that role. Sarah was an oops baby, so her brother is 16 years older than she is. After that first lunch, I started seeing Sarah a lot more often. We made a point to get together with Jason at least once a week, doing something fun as a family. Brian was there too, but they kept their couple-like behavior to a minimum, which made things easier for me. I have to admit, I really enjoyed being around Sarah again and talking to her. It felt like we were falling back into the same kind of conversations we used to have when we first started dating. Then, as the back-to-school season hit, things shifted. Brian's screen printing business got swamped with orders. Fall sports, staff shirts, clubs, Greek life, all of it. He had contracts with all the school districts and local colleges, so he was swamped. That meant Sarah, Jason, and I started spending a lot more time together, just the three of us. As the months went by, Sarah and I got closer. Our greetings shifted from casual side hugs to lingering, full-on hugs. We'd talk for hours about everything, and it started to feel like the early days of our relationship all over again. Even when Brian started joining us again, Sarah and I continued rebuilding our friendship. And then, the most incredible thing happened. Jason started calling me Dad. I teared up the first 10 times he said it. It was overwhelming in the best way. Life carried on, and before I knew it, the wedding was just a week away. I wasn't planning to attend, but my parents were invited as guests. That weekend, they were throwing a semi-combined bachelor/bachelorette party. The plan was that each would go out to dinner with their friends, do their own thing, his was at Topgolf, and then they'd all meet up at a bar or club around 11 p.m. I wasn't part of any of this, and I had no idea where they planned to end up. But instead of staying in my apartment sulking, I decided to go out for the night. It was hard for me, knowing Sarah was about to marry someone else, even if that someone else was a good guy. No matter how much I tried, it still hurt. Around 10:30 that night, after a few drinks and with a good buzz going, I was about to call an Uber to head home when Sarah and her group of friends walked into the bar. At first, I stayed hidden in the crowd, not wanting to intrude on her night, but she spotted me almost immediately and came over to talk. Our conversation turned a little flirty, and when one of her favorite songs came on, she started dancing, and then dancing with me. We were laughing, having fun, and caught up in the moment. As the song ended, she stumbled into me, and I caught her. We were standing so close, and for a split second, our lips almost touched. But just as we were about to kiss, she pulled back. We both laughed it off awkwardly and headed to the bar for a drink. In hindsight, it was probably a good thing we didn't kiss, because a couple of minutes later, Brian walked up. He tried to be his usual friendly self, but something seemed a little off. They kissed, and suddenly I felt like the third wheel. I decided it was time to leave, so I ordered my Uber and went home. The next day, I was nursing a hangover and slept in late. It was a lazy Sunday, and around midday, I heard someone trying to open my front door. The door was locked, and then came the heavy knocking. I rushed over and opened it, and there stood Sarah. She lunged into my arms and kissed me, without hesitation. It was the sweetest feeling I'd ever experienced. Confusing, yes, but incredibly sweet nonetheless. I asked her what was going on, and she said, "Brian came to me this morning and started asking some tough questions. I don't want to get into it now. I promise I'll tell you everything one day, but I'm not ready yet. We decided to end things. I admitted that my feelings for you are still strong, and he said he understood. It hurt him, but he knew. He told me we both deserve to be happy, and he's stepping away. I called your parents, and they're fine with keeping Jason a little longer. I love you and want to be with you, and I'm guessing you feel the same way." I told her that's all I've ever wanted. It was a whirlwind from there. She had 2 bags packed for her and Jason, and they moved in with me that same day. The next day, my father went to visit Brian. He told me Brian looked a little hungover and had taken the day off work. They had a conversation, and my dad tried to be as empathetic as possible. He just wanted to check on him since Brian had been such a big part of their lives over the past few years. He asked Brian what his next steps were. Brian said, besides trying to get some deposits back, he had no idea. My dad offered to refund him the money and take over the reservations. He didn't ask why. My dad thinks Brian already knew. While that was happening, I had to go to work and face Mike. As soon as I arrived, he called me into his office. He had me sit down and started. "Let me say my piece. I'm angry. My brother tells me to let it go, and I will. I want to take that anger out on you, but I won't. My brother and I learned a tough lesson about revenge back in high school, and we swore we'd always be the bigger men. That said, I think it's best we part ways. My family needs time to heal, but I won't leave you hanging. You've got a week of paid time off. In that time, I want you to talk to an acquaintance of mine, Lee. He runs a construction company and is willing to hire you at your current salary. It's commercial, not residential, but you'll be fine." I stood up to thank him, but he cut me off. "This isn't for you, it's for Brian. Now go grab your things and head out." I contacted Lee that same day, and he said I could start in 2 weeks. When my father came back and told us he'd taken control of the wedding accommodations, Sarah and I just looked at each other and knew what we wanted. It wasn't the beach wedding we'd always dreamed of, but it was perfect in its own way. Ironically, it was Brian who had wanted the traditional wedding, but in the end, it turned out to be an amazing time. Jorge was my best man, and Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her dress. Finding a tux rental for me on such short notice was a bit of a headache, but it all worked out. We didn't have huge groups of friends or family, but it was wonderful to celebrate with the people who had supported us through the darkest times. It's been a month since the wedding, and I still can't quite believe it. Jason had some trouble adjusting. He misses Brian, but lately he seems happier. To think about where I was and where I am now, I can't help but feel incredibly lucky.